The fluorescent lights of Joe's Diner cut through the winter darkness, a beacon for weary travelers along Highway 43. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with sizzling bacon created that familiar comfort that only small-town diners seem to get just right. It was February 1982, and the night shift was in full swing. Behind the counter, Rose wiped down the coffee-stained surface for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Her comfortable shoes squeaked against the checkered floor as she moved between the regulars, truck drivers taking their mandatory breaks, factory workers grabbing a bite before the graveyard shift, and the occasional insomniac seeking company in the lonely hours. "Order up," called out Jimmy from the kitchen, his voice competing with the soft country music playing from the old jukebox in the corner. Rose grabbed the plate of steaming hashed browns and eggs, delivering it with a warm smile to Mr. Wilson, who had been coming in every Thursday night for the past decade since his wife passed. The snow was falling harder now, creating peaceful patterns in the glow of the parking lot lights. Rose had worked the late-night shift at Joe's for 3 years, and she knew every regular's story, every creak in the floor, and exactly how many steps it took to get from the coffee maker to table 712, if you were wondering. The bell of the door chimed as 2 young nurses walked in, shaking snow from their scrubs. "The usual?" Rose called out, already reaching for the chocolate pie they always ordered after their hospital shifts. They nodded gratefully, their tired faces brightening at the sight of their favorite comfort food. The diner's windows were starting to fog up from the contrast between the warm interior and the frigid night outside. Rose adjusted the thermostat, knowing that Big Joe, the owner, would complain about the heating bill, but she couldn't bear to see people shivering while they ate. She paused at the counter to refill her own coffee cup, taking in the scene before her. There was something special about these night hours, when the world outside slowed down, but life inside the diner kept its own steady rhythm. The clink of forks against plates, the quiet conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from the corner booth where the college students were taking a study break. It was all part of the nightly symphony she had come to love. The radio crackled with news about an incoming snowstorm, but Rose wasn't worried. The diner had weathered plenty of storms before, serving as an unofficial shelter during the worst of them. She'd lost count of how many times they'd stayed open past closing time, keeping the coffee hot and the griddle warm for stranded travelers. Little did she know that tonight would be different. Tonight, her simple job of serving coffee and comfort food would turn into something much more meaningful. But for now, she was just doing what she did best, being there for anyone who needed a warm meal and a friendly face in the middle of the night. As she finished arranging the sugar packets in their containers, she caught her reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. Her name tag was slightly crooked, and a few strands of hair had escaped from her practical bun. She straightened both automatically, a habit born from years of taking pride in her work, no matter how small the details. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m. The night was still young by diner standards, and Rose had that familiar feeling that something interesting was bound to happen. In a 24-hour diner, every night had its own story to tell, but none of her previous experiences could have prepared her for the events that were about to unfold. Events that would change not just her life, but the entire community's approach to looking after its own. The wind picked up outside Joe's Diner, pushing snowflakes against the windows like tiny stars trying to find their way home. Rose had just finished refilling the napkin dispensers when she heard the bell above the door. The sound was different somehow, hesitant, almost apologetic. Through the door came an elderly man, his military jacket dusted with snow, his movements slow and uncertain. The jacket had patches that spoke of service in Korea, though time had faded their once bright colors. His entrance caught everyone's attention, not because it was dramatic, but because something about it felt wrong, like a piano key played slightly out of tune. The man stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. The regular customers glanced up, then quickly returned to their meals, practicing that urban habit of polite disinterest. But Rose noticed things others might miss, his hands trembling as they gripped the door frame, his breathing coming in short, visible puffs in the warm diner air, the confusion in his eyes as they darted around the room without seeming to land on anything. "Evening, sir," Rose called out, already moving toward him with a menu in hand. Up close, she could see his lips had a bluish tint, and his clothes were damp from the snow. Something in her chest tightened, the same feeling she used to get during her nursing classes when something wasn't right with a patient. The man tried to focus on her face. I need to get home to Betty," he mumbled, his words slurring slightly. "She'll be worried about the groceries." He patted his pockets, which Rose could see were empty except for what looked like a worn playing card peeking out. Rose guided him gently to the nearest booth, noting how cold his arm felt even through his jacket. The booth closest to the kitchen was always the warmest spot in the diner, and she steered him there with the practiced ease of someone used to helping others find their way. "Let's warm you up first," she said, her voice calm and steady. "How about some hot coffee?" But the man's attention had already drifted to the window, where he stared at the swirling snow as if trying to read a message in its patterns. Behind the counter, Tommy, the night cook, raised his eyebrows at Rose. She knew that look. It was the Universal Diner employee code for trouble customer. "Want me to call the cops?" Rose shook her head slightly. This wasn't trouble walking in. This was trouble walking into a safe haven, even if the person in trouble didn't know it yet. The man's fingers fumbled with the menu, turning it upside down, then sideways, his confusion becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "Betty always orders for me," he said, his voice catching. "She knows what I like. Been ordering for me since 55. Rose noticed other details now. His wedding ring was well worn but spotlessly clean. His shoes were carefully polished despite being soaked with snow, and there was a small American flag pin on his lapel. This was someone's husband, someone's father, someone who had once stood straight and proud in that military jacket. And now he was lost in more ways than one. The jukebox switched songs, and the man's head snapped up at the opening notes of an old Johnny Cash tune. For a moment, his eyes cleared. "Betty and I danced to this at our wedding," he said, and for that brief moment, he was completely present. Then the clarity faded, replaced by that same confused, searching look. The snow outside was getting thicker, and the radio behind the counter crackled with updates about road conditions worsening. Rose glanced at the clock. Midnight had come and gone. She knew she had to make a decision soon. This wasn't just another customer seeking shelter from the storm. This was someone who needed help but couldn't ask for it. The night was about to take a turn that would test everything Rose believed about responsibility, community, and what it means to really see the people in front of you. As she watched the elderly man's trembling hands try to grasp a menu he couldn't read, she felt the weight of the moment settling around her like the snow outside, quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Rose couldn't shake the memory of her nursing training as she watched the elderly veteran struggle with the menu. 2 years of classes before life took her down a different path had taught her enough to recognize when something wasn't right. His confusion, the blue tinge to his lips, the way his hands shook, these weren't just signs of someone having a rough night. "I need to make a phone call," she told Tommy, the cook, her voice low and steady. Behind the kitchen's swinging door, she pulled out the worn emergency contact book that Big Joe kept by the phone. Her fingers moved down the list until she found Dr. Chen's home number. The kind-hearted physician had left it with them years ago, saying diners often saw trouble before hospitals did. But before she could dial, Big Joe's voice came from his tiny office. "Everything all right out there?" He appeared in the doorway, worry lines creasing his forehead. "Tommy says we've got a situation." Rose explained what she'd observed, her words coming faster as she connected the dots out loud. "He's showing signs of severe hypothermia, Joe. The confusion, the shaking, and I think there's something else going on. His breathing isn't right." Big Joe rubbed his face, years of late-night management decisions weighing in his sigh. Maybe we should just call the police. Let them handle it. We're a diner, not a hospital. The words hit Rose like a splash of cold water. She thought about all the times people had looked the other way, choosing the easy path over the right one. Images flashed through her mind. Her grandmother, alone in a nursing home where staff were too busy to notice when she stopped eating. Her neighbor, Mr. Parker, who'd had a heart attack gardening while everyone drove past, assuming he was just resting. "I can't do that, Joe," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Look at his jacket. He served our country. And now he needs someone to serve him. Really look at him. He's someone's whole world who just happened to get lost tonight." Through the kitchen window, they could see the elderly man attempting to fold his paper napkin into something. Maybe a plane, maybe a flower. His movements were becoming slower, more confused. The few remaining customers had gone quiet, sensing something was happening, but unsure what to do. "My nursing instructor used to say we're all just one bad moment away from meeting someone else's courage," Rose continued, her hand gripping the phone receiver. "I couldn't finish nursing school when Dad got sick, but that doesn't mean I stopped caring. We can't just pass him along like a problem to solve. He's a person to help." Big Joe was quiet for a long moment, watching Rose with an expression she'd never seen before. Finally, he nodded. "What do you need?" "Cover my section for 20 minutes. I'm going to try something." Rose straightened her apron, a plan forming in her mind. "If I'm wrong, I'll work a double shift to make up for it. But if I'm right—" She let the sentence hang there, both of them knowing what could happen if no one acted. As she walked back into the dining room, Rose felt the weight of every step. Sometimes the biggest choices in life don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in quietly, disguised as small moments, testing who we really are when it matters most. The elderly veteran looked up as she approached his table, his eyes briefly clear. "You remind me of my daughter," he said softly. "She always knows what to do too." The trust in his voice made Rose's decision even clearer. Standing there in her waitress uniform, notepad still tucked in her pocket, Rose realized that sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even if it's not where you plan to go. Her name-tag might not say nurse, but tonight that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here. She knew enough to recognize the danger, and she was willing to act. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside Joe's diner, the warmth had nothing to do with the heating system. It came from the simple truth that when one person chooses to care, really care, the whole world can shift on its axis. And Rose was about to prove just how much difference that choice could make. The keys to Rose's old Chevy felt heavy in her pocket as she helped the elderly veteran to his feet. She'd never done anything like this before, leaving her shift to drive a stranger to the hospital. But sometimes doing the right thing means writing your own rulebook. "I'm going to help you find Betty," she said softly, supporting his elbow as he swayed. "But first, we need to get you warmed up properly. Will you trust me?" The man looked at her with those confused eyes, but somewhere in them, she saw a flicker of understanding. Tommy stepped out from behind the grill, wiping his hands on his apron. "Rose, you sure about this? The storm's getting worse." Through the windows, the snow was coming down in thick curtains, transforming the parking lot into a white blanket. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My car's got good tires, and the hospital's only 15 minutes away." She didn't add that it would be the longest 15 minutes of her life. Big Joe appeared with his own coat. "Here," he said, wrapping it around the veteran's shoulders. "It's not much, but it's warm." The coat dwarfed the elderly man, making him look even more fragile. Someone had turned down the jukebox, and the diner felt unusually quiet, like everyone was holding their breath. The walk to her car was slow and careful. Rose kept one arm firmly around the veteran's waist, feeling his shivers through both jackets. The snow crunched under their feet, and the wind bit at their faces. Her old Chevy, usually so reliable, looked suddenly small against the vast whiteness of the storm. "Watch your head," she murmured, helping him into the passenger seat. The car protested with a groan as she turned the key, but the engine caught, humming to life. The heater sputtered, then began blowing warm air. In the glow of the dashboard lights, she could see the veteran's face more clearly. The blue tinge of his lips had deepened. As they pulled out of the diner's parking lot, Rose began talking, keeping her voice calm and steady. "So, tell me about Betty. How did you two meet?" She needed to keep him awake, keep him talking. "Dance hall, 1952, he mumbled, each word a struggle. She was wearing a blue dress, matched her eyes. His voice drifted off, then came back. "She's waiting, with the groceries." The windshield wipers pushed back the heavy snow, creating a rhythm that matched Rose's racing heart. Every few seconds, she glanced at her passenger, watching his chest rise and fall. The hospital was still 10 minutes away. "My grandmother loved to dance too," Rose said, turning carefully onto the main road. "She taught me the waltz in our kitchen. Said every girl should know how to dance, even if just with her cats." A small smile flickered across the veteran's face. The streets were deserted, the storm having chased everyone inside. Rose's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the car slid slightly on a turn. In the distance, she could just make out the red glow of the hospital's emergency sign, like a lighthouse in a white sea. "Almost there," she said, more to herself than her passenger. The veteran's head had dropped forward, his breathing becoming more labored. "Hey, stay with me. Tell me more about that dance hall. Did they play Glenn Miller?" His response was so quiet, she almost missed it. "First dance, Moonlight Serenade." The hospital parking lot appeared through the swirling snow, and Rose's headlights caught the reflective signs pointing to the emergency entrance. As she pulled up to the doors, she could see medical staff already moving inside, alerted by her high beams. In that moment, watching the emergency team rush out with a wheelchair, Rose realized something important. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage don't look like what we expect. Sometimes they look like a waitress in a diner uniform, driving through a snowstorm, talking about dance halls and love stories from long ago. The night wasn't over yet, but as she helped the medical team with her passenger, Rose knew that whatever happened next, she'd done what needed to be done. In a world that often looked the other way, she'd chosen to look closer, to act, to care. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The emergency room buzzed with quiet efficiency as Rose sat in the waiting area, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of hospital coffee that didn't taste nearly as good as the diner's. She couldn't bring herself to leave, not until she knew if she'd done enough. Her apron still smelled of bacon and coffee, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary night had turned extraordinary. The sliding doors whispered open, letting in a blast of cold air, and 2 police officers shaking snow from their coats. They spoke briefly with a desk nurse, who pointed in Rose's direction. Her heart skipped a beat, but she sat up straighter, ready to explain her actions. "You're the waitress?" the older officer asked, pulling out a small notebook. His name tag read Officer Clark, and his expression was kind. "Can you tell us what happened?" Rose told them everything. The veteran's confusion, his blue-tinged lips, the talk of Betty and groceries. As she spoke, a doctor in blue scrubs appeared, his face showing the weariness of a long night shift. "You got him here just in time," the doctor said, joining their conversation. He was in the early stages of a heart attack, complicated by severe hypothermia. If he'd stayed out in that weather. He let the sentence hang, but they all understood what had been at stake. "We found his ID," Officer Clark added. "His name is Richard Thompson. Retired Army Corps of Engineers, lives about 3 miles from your diner. His daughter's been searching for him since yesterday evening. Turns out he left his weekly card game at the Veterans Center, but never made it home." The doctor cleared his throat. "There's more." The confusion wasn't just from the cold. Early-stage dementia, probably been developing for a while. His family suspected something was wrong, but hadn't gotten a diagnosis yet. Rose thought about the playing card in Richard's pocket, how he tried to fold that napkin at the diner. Little pieces of a puzzle suddenly fitting together. Is Betty his wife? She asked, remembering how he talked about her. A shadow passed over Officer Clark's face. Betty passed away last spring. They were married for 47 years. His daughter says he sometimes forgets she's gone, especially when he's stressed. The weight of this information settled over Rose like a heavy blanket. She thought about all the little ways life could unravel. How someone could go from dancing in a hall to wandering in a snowstorm, looking for a love who was no longer there. Is his daughter coming? Rose asked, thinking about her own father, how vulnerable he'd seemed during his illness. She's on her way from the city, the nurse at the desk chimed in. Should be here within the hour, weather permitting. The doctor touched Rose's shoulder lightly. What made you notice something was wrong? Most people would have just assumed he was confused, maybe had too much to drink. Rose thought about her nursing classes, about all the signs and symptoms she'd learned. But that wasn't really it. I guess. I just saw him. Really saw him. The way he held himself, how carefully his shoes were polished even though he was lost. Sometimes people tell you who they are in the quietest ways. The flutter of activity at the emergency room entrance drew their attention. A woman in her 50s hurried in, snow dusting her dark coat. Her eyes scanned the room frantically until Officer Clark waved her over. This had to be Richard's daughter. Dad? Is he? She started, worry etching deep lines around her mouth. He's stable, the doctor assured her quickly. And we have this young lady to thank for that. He gestured to Rose, who suddenly felt very aware of her diner uniform and messy hair. The daughter's eyes met Rose's, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding of how the world works when people choose to care, really care, about strangers. Without warning, she pulled Rose into a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing my father when he couldn't see himself. Standing there in the hospital waiting room, still smelling of coffee and wearing her waitress uniform, Rose realized that sometimes the biggest moments in life don't announce themselves with fanfare. They come quietly, disguised as simple choices, like noticing an elderly veteran on a snowy night and choosing to do more than just bring him a menu. News travels fast in small towns, and the story of the diner waitress who saved a veteran's life spread like wildfire through Millbrook. By the time Rose returned to work the next evening, something had shifted in the air, something bigger than just one night's events. Big Joe had barely opened the diner's door when Mrs. Chen from the dry cleaners next door came rushing in. My mother lives alone, she said without preamble, her usually quiet voice urgent with purpose. She's too proud to admit she needs help, but after hearing what happened, she paused, twisting her hands together. Could we maybe create a system? Check in on her sometimes. The idea sparked something in Big Joe's eyes. He'd been thinking about his own father, living alone 3 states away. What if we did more than that? He said slowly. What if we made it official? A community watch, but for our elderly neighbors. The morning regulars, who'd heard the story from the night shift, started chiming in. There was the retired schoolteacher who knew every family in town, the postal worker who noticed when mail started piling up, and the grocery store owner who could tell when elderly customers stopped coming in. My church group could help, offered one customer, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. We've got plenty of volunteers, just never had an organized way to use them. Rose listened from behind the counter, amazed at how quickly people were coming together. The local newspaper editor, finishing his usual breakfast, was already scribbling notes. This could be bigger than Millbrook, he said. Other towns might want to do the same thing. That afternoon, Richard's daughter stopped by the diner. She looked tired but hopeful, clutching a folder full of papers. Dad's doing better, she said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. The doctors say he can come home soon, but she spread the papers out. Pamphlets about dementia, care facility brochures, support group schedules. I don't want to put him in a home, she continued, her voice catching. But I live an hour away, and after this scare, she looked up as several regular customers moved closer, drawn by her story. My sister's a retired nurse, one woman offered. She'd be happy to look in on him a few times a week. Another customer mentioned his teenage son needed volunteer hours for school. A third had a spare emergency phone they could program with important numbers. The chief of police came in for his usual lunch and ended up staying an hour, working with Big Joe to create a phone tree. The high school computer teacher volunteered to set up a website where people could sign up for check-in shifts. The local pharmacy offered to start a prescription delivery service. Rose watched it all unfold from behind the counter, refilling coffee cups and listening to ideas bounce back and forth. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was turning into the headquarters of something beautiful. By evening, what started as a simple idea had grown into a real plan. They called it Neighbors Looking After Neighbors, though some of the regulars just called it the Rose Watch, much to her embarrassment. The program was simple. Volunteers would check on elderly residents, helping with small tasks and making sure they were okay. The local bank manager even offered to set up a small fund for emergency expenses, things like snow shoveling for elderly residents or transportation to doctor's appointments. The grocery store promised to deliver orders for free to seniors who couldn't drive in bad weather. You started something special here, Big Joe told Rose as they watched the impromptu planning meeting continue into the night. The diner buzzed with energy, napkins covered in notes and ideas being passed from table to table. Rose shook her head, thinking about that snowy night and Richard's polished shoes. I didn't start anything, she said softly. I just did what needed doing. Everyone else is making it special. But she knew something had changed. In a world that often felt too busy to care, her small town had remembered how to look out for its own. All it took was one story, one night, one person choosing to stop and really see someone in need. Through the window, she could see the diner's neon sign reflecting off the melting snow, its glow a little warmer somehow. Tomorrow, there would be forms to fill out, schedules to create, and details to arrange. But tonight, in this moment, Rose simply watched her community come together, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. 5 years later, the corner booth at Joe's Diner had become known as the Veterans Corner. Richard sat there most Thursday evenings, dealing cards and sharing stories with other retired service members. His health had improved since that snowy night, and while his memory still played tricks on him sometimes, he was never truly alone anymore. Rose watched from behind the counter as she poured coffee, just like she had done thousands of times before. But now, alongside the usual dinner orders, she kept a notebook of community check-ins. The Neighbors Looking After Neighbors program had grown beyond anything they'd imagined that first night. Your usual, Richard, she called out, already reaching for the pie. He nodded, his eyes twinkling. They both knew it was more than just pie that brought him back to the diner. It was the comfort of being somewhere people knew your name, your story, and how you liked your coffee. The bell of the door chimed, and a reporter from the state newspaper walked in, notebook in hand. The program had caught attention beyond their small town. 3 neighboring communities had started their own versions, and others were asking how to do the same. I don't understand why everyone's so interested, Rose told the reporter as she served him a cup of coffee. We just did what neighbors are supposed to do. But the reporter had done his research. He had numbers. How many seniors had been helped? How many emergency situations had been prevented? How many families had found peace of mind? The program had even caught the attention of state officials looking for solutions to support aging communities. It's more than just checking on people, Richard's daughter explained to the reporter. She'd become a regular visitor too, coordinating volunteer schedules from that same corner booth. It's about dignity, about remembering that everyone has a story worth hearing. The diner's walls now held photos of community gatherings, holiday meals for those who'd otherwise be alone, birthday celebrations for elderly residents, even a weekly dance night that had started when they discovered how many seniors missed the simple joy of moving to music. Big Joe had installed a new phone system with a special line just for check-in calls. The local high school had started giving community service credits to students who volunteered. Even the town's budget now included funding for senior support services inspired by what had started in the diner. "Tell me about that night," the reporter asked Rose, his pen poised above his notebook. "The night that started it all." Rose paused, watching Richard laugh with his card-playing friends. She thought about how close they'd come to losing him that snowy evening. "It wasn't about being brave," she said finally. "It was about seeing someone who needed help and not looking away. Sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Or a whole community." The program hadn't solved every problem. There were still lonely people, still struggles and hard days. But something fundamental had shifted in how the town looked after its own. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a hub where people connected, where help was asked for and given, where no one had to pretend they could handle everything alone. As the evening wound down, Rose watched Richard put on his coat, no longer the confused man from that winter night. His daughter would drive him home, but not before he hugged Rose goodbye, like he did every Thursday. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "Betty would have loved what you've all done here." Through the window, Rose could see volunteers from the evening shift heading out to make their rounds, checking on neighbors, delivering meals, or just stopping by for a chat. The neon sign still flickered against the darkening sky, but now they meant something more. A beacon of community, of caring, of people choosing to look out for each other. Later that night, as she wiped down the counter one last time, Rose found herself humming Moonlight Serenade, the song Richard and Betty had danced to at their wedding. Outside, the town slept peacefully, knowing that if anyone needed help, they weren't alone. All because one ordinary night at a small town diner, someone had chosen to really see a stranger in need. And that, more than anything, was the real story worth telling.